Today I'm going to be ranking every live-action Resident Evil film. Now I don't know exactly how popular these movies are, but like many, I'm a gigantic fan of the video games. Resident Evil 2 and 4 are just chef's kiss. And since I recently binged all of these, I figured why not do what I do and rank them from worst to best. Now things to keep in mind, I will only be ranking the 7 live-action films. So that being the 6 starring Mila Jovovich and 2021's Reboot. This won't include any of the CG animated films or the Netflix series either. Also, this kind of feels weird to say, but slight spoiler warning ahead for anyone who has never watched any of these films. And as always, this is all subjective and purely based on my opinion. This doesn't have the T-virus, does it? So kicking off this list at number 7, Resident Evil Retribution. It happens pretty often in franchises where there's that one film that just kind of fades away in the back. The one movie that just doesn't quite do enough to live up to the rest and ends up getting forgotten. And well, this is that one for me. Which kind of sucks because you can really tell that there was a lot of effort put into this one. From the entire premise of the clones basically living in simulations, the gigantic dome containing recreations of iconic cities for these clones, to actors of earlier films reprising versions of their characters, and even including some of the biggest characters from the source material, all in one movie. The intention and the ambition were clear, but the execution just never held as strong. Coming in at number 6, Resident Evil Afterlife. It's clear one of the things this franchise tried to do was tell one big story amongst all the little stories and plot points within. With certain characters from the source material popping up here and there, the franchise sort of assumes you've played the game and are familiar with the original stories. In a way, it's cool to see, but in even more ways, it hurts the films because it doesn't really offer that much for newcomers. People who have never played the games can only really enjoy maybe 2 things. One thing being the action sequences, which can be pretty over the top, but still entertaining. And another being some of the film's plot points. But really, that's honestly it. And it isn't much. And it's all this movie has to offer, which is sadly why it belongs so low on this list. Coming in at number 5, Resident Evil Extinction. This was definitely the first film in the entire franchise that tried to explore a little further into the overall premise established in the first film. While the first 2 films do go hand in hand, this movie was the first to go beyond what we've seen so far. From a more open setting to more practical action sequences, this movie seemed hungry to accomplish something new. I also found it interesting how the beginning of this movie kind of feels like an alternate version of the first film, but was shortly later revealed that it was instead the antagonist of the movie, trying to recreate certain things from the first film by literally creating clones of the character Alice to somehow recreate how perfect she is and ultimately use her as a weapon. Now that's not something necessarily groundbreaking, but it was something that surprised me the first time I watched this movie. I really didn't expect them to go this route, and it really set up Alice as a much more important character than ever before. Coming in at number 4, Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City. Now there's a reason 2021's Reboot is placed at number 4. The number 4 spot in a list of 7 clearly makes this the middle point, the exact in-between. And that's honestly how I feel about this movie. I'm so split on this movie. Exactly 50-50. I remember being so disappointed but also confused the first time I watched this movie. But then as time went on and I kept thinking about it, my thoughts and feelings became much clearer. And I realized I have a solid love-hate relationship for this movie. On one end, I hate this movie because of the amount that it suffered from carrying the weight of trying to bite off way more than it can chew. Simply trying to adapt not 1 but 2 entire video games into one movie, that's just such an impossible task. That and the terrible way some of the characters were written was just heartbreaking for me to watch as a fan. But the side of me that loves this movie is exactly why this movie isn't ranked lower in this list. And it's simply because of all the movies in this list, this movie contains the most fan service. And though it did seem to value fan service over anything else, you can't deny that they at least tried to give fans of the source material something to enjoy. Now, coming in at number 3, Resident Evil Afterlife. Off the bat, something that I like about this movie is how organically it continues the events from the first film. The first movie, taking place entirely in one single location, meant its entire focus stayed in that one location. This movie not only picks up where we left off, but also showcases everything going on beyond that one location from the first film. Now, the movie does feel outdated, this time more so because of its stylistic action, just feels very over the top and unrealistic. Later movies in the franchise can kind of get away with it, I guess because the CGI was better, but in this movie it's pretty noticeable. Granted, the character of Alice is supposed to be a highly skilled badass, but even then this movie feels very over the top in so many ways. All that being said, as far from perfect as this movie is, it's still a blast for me to watch, and I do think it holds up as a solid follow-up to the first film. Coming in at number 2, Resident Evil: The Final Chapter. This is kind of a weird position for me because as many times as I've watched these movies, I never considered this one to be one of my favorites, let alone consider it to be in such a top spot. And I can't really say that this is one of the best movies in the entire franchise, but it is my second favorite for certain reasons. It's straight to the point. It cuts out all the extra unwanted bits that the other movies play around with. Alice is exactly where she left off from the previous film, but shortly finds out what she needs to do, how she needs to do it, and where she needs to go to get it done. The rest of the movie is really just her journey, getting from point A to point B. And though other movies do feel similar, the purpose of this one is much more simple, and in result feels much more clear. Also, this movie feels like a proper farewell to the franchise, and especially to the character of Alice, who we spent 14 years with at this point. Now, it's not a perfect film by any means, but it somehow does feel like a perfect ending. Add in some solid action, another kick-ass performance by Mila Jovovich, and a full circle conclusion to the entire storyline, and you've got yourself a more than worthy finish to the entire franchise. Coming in at number 1, Resident Evil. What's kind of funny about this movie is that, in a weird way, you could take away every single relation it has to the source material, and it would still be a solid zombie film, especially in the time it was released. This movie really did feel like it knew exactly what it was going for, like it knew what it wanted to do. It knew it was an entirely different story told than the one from the video game, and it knew it wasn't really going to adapt much from the video game either. Instead, it focused more on standing on its own 2 feet as something new. One of my favorite things about this movie too is that it really does feel grounded. Like I mentioned before, this movie takes place entirely in one single location, and in result seemed to be a much more focused premise. Sure, in today's standards, a lot of it does feel very outdated, especially the CGI. But again, for the time it was released in 2002, it really wasn't terrible. The cast itself was great, and I like how the movie made some pretty bold decisions to kill off certain major characters pretty early on in the movie too. And of course, Mila Jovovich is going to be a standout in anything she's in. So having such a strong lead kick off a franchise wasn't a bad move either. Now, the rest of the movies in this franchise aren't exactly incredible films to compete against, but this movie isn't on the top spot for that reason. This movie takes the top spot, because had this been the only live-action Resident Evil movie ever made, it would be a solid Resident Evil movie in its own right. And I don't know if I can say the same thing about the rest of the movies in this list. So, that was my ranking of every live-action Resident Evil film. How would you rank these films? Let me know down below. I really do appreciate your time. It means more to me than you know. And as always, I'll catch you on the next one.